added. It is now my pleasure, without any further delay, to introduce today's speaker, Elizabeth Evitts Dickinson. We are so pleased that you're here with us today, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining. A little bit about Elizabeth. She's the author of the critically acclaimed biography, Claire McCardell, the designer who set women free, which was just recently released on June 17th. An award-winning journalist and author, Dickinson's writing has been widely published in the New York Times, Harper's, the New Yorker, the Southern Review, and the Washington Post magazine, among many others. She's a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, and her work has earned recognition in anthologies such as the Best American Essays, and has been awarded Maryland's prestigious Mary Sayers Imboden Prize for Literature. Dickinson teaches writing in the graphic design MFA program at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and she lives in Baltimore with her husband and daughter. And today we are so very pleased to hear about your brand new book on Claire McCardell. And so without any delay, I will go ahead and turn things over to you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Oh my gosh, Molly, thank you so much. And we're also joined today by my corgi buddy who isn't a fan of the weather we're having in Maryland right now. So if you hear an occasional woof, that's Buddy making his frustration with thunder known. I am so grateful to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum for having me this morning. 16-year-old me would just be in awe of the fact that I get to talk about O'Keeffe today. I was like many teen girls, a huge fan of O'Keeffe. And when I discovered her modernism and her pioneering art, she forever changed how I saw the world. And so today I'm really excited to share with you my talk about Claire McCardell and this book that I just put out. So don't mind me, just one quick, there we go. So Georgia O'Keeffe wasn't just a revolutionary when it came to modern art. Of course, she had an aesthetic. And there have been some really exceptional exhibitions, including the Georgia O'Keeffe Living Modern exhibition from a few years ago, that really meticulously researched the ways in which O'Keeffe's vision and style and aesthetic carried through not just in her art, but in her designs for living. And here we're seeing O'Keeffe wearing her favorite, or one of her favorite, Claire McCardell dresses. And, you know, O'Keeffe was disciplined in her refined modernism and the types of clothes she wore. And I think it's interesting to understand why it is that McCardell became one of O'Keeffe's favorite designers. So, who was Claire McCardell? So, Claire McCardell is, for many, the most influential fashion designer you've likely never heard of. I assume some on this call have heard of her. She is, in effect, responsible for much of what hangs in our closets today. She was the originator and helped to really create what became known as the American look, which is casual, comfortable, more affordable sportswear. And there are many designers today like Calvin Klein, Tory Burch, others in the fashion industry who credit McCardell really with pioneering what we know about fashion today. So it helps to kind of understand why McCardell is so revolutionary by understanding where we came from. And I'm going to give you the world's fastest tour through a little bit of fashion history. So it helps to go back to kind of understand the silhouette, the shapes of clothes, what sort of was the tradition of fashion. And as you can see, you know, we had these highly structured clothes for many centuries. We had corsets, we had understructures, we had bustles, the things at the back that sort of bumped out the rear. And you start to see the evolution in those silhouettes over time, but really there was a consistency in the sort of structured way in which these clothes were layered. And for most of the early fashion history, the designs were coming from royalty. You were seeing the designs set by, queens and princesses, and they were being made by nameless seamstresses in these courts. But then in the 1850s, you get the House of Worth in Paris. And really, what the House of Worth did, Charles Worth was one of the first couture designers, if not the first, who kind of moved fashion out of the royal system and into the couture house in Paris. And so now you start to see the designer becoming the purveyor of style. And it was still very much a wealthy person's game, right? If you could afford to go to the House of Worth or to other couturiers in Paris, you could have your clothes custom made. And this silhouette would continue to evolve until you get to the sort of 1890s, early 1900s with this Gibson Girl S silhouette. And this was, again, a very highly structured shape. You had this S curve in the body, and the corset helped to achieve it. And it was what one fashion historian said, poor women looked a little bit like pigeons about to topple over. As you can see, it wasn't very comfortable looking. And this was the silhouette that Claire McCardell was born into. She was born in 1905 in Frederick, Maryland, which is a rural town in Maryland. And at the time, Paris was still the fashion capital of the world. America took most of its cues from Paris. There really wasn't a fashion industry in America per se. It was more of a manufacturing center that would copy or steal or recreate Parisian designs. And clothes for someone like Claire McCardell, who was born into a middle-class family in Frederick, would have been made by sewing at home. So there wasn't a lot of ready to wear. You couldn't just grab things off the rack. You either made your clothes by patterns, you made them from memory, or you made them, as the McCardells did, by inviting in a seamstress twice a year to help make clothes. And in McCardell's case, her mother always used the Vogue patterns because they came from the most stylish place, Paris. And this is what passed for sportswear in the 1900s. I always feel so much sympathy for those women mountain climbing in full skirts and high heels. And of course, bathing suits looked like dresses because they were effectively dresses. The idea was you were going to go take a dip into the water and you were going to bathe. You weren't going to swim. But McCardell was born of a generation of women who really wanted to not just sit back and watch sports, they wanted to participate. And McCardell was very much involved in sports as a kid, or just fishing, hiking, being in the mountains around her home. And she was, I guess, what we would call a tomboy now. She loved to climb trees and she loved to play sports with her brothers. And this is McCardell. On the left, you see her wearing a dress at the age of 7. She helped to make that dress with the family seamstress, a woman named Annie Kugel. Claire, from a very early age, was fascinated with sewing, with clothes, and with making. And she also very quickly understood that there was a difference in the clothes that she was wearing and the clothes that her brothers got to wear. She was the oldest of 3 brothers. And she earned the nickname Kick for good reason as a kid. She often wanted to play in the boys' games and sometimes had to resort to asserting her will in ways other than words. And she just never really understood why it was that she had to climb trees in that dress she's wearing while her brothers had pants and pockets and practical clothes. And McCardell became very witty over her lifetime in sort of pointing out the ridiculousness of women's fashions. She said, I don't really hate crinolines, those big, boofy understructures that made a skirt huge. She said, I hate when they try to get into elevators. She pointed out the modernity of life and the ways in which traditional clothing got in the ways for women. And what I want to point out is what's McCardell wearing there in that photo? She's wearing menswear. She's wearing a tweed suit on a steamship. And, you know, this was a time when women could still get arrested for wearing pants in public. And, you know, tweed was a gendered fabric in a lot of ways. It was considered a male fabric. And the other thing I want to point out is, where is her hand? McCardell's hand is in her pocket because she believed that women deserved pockets as much as men. And she understood pockets to be not only practical because you could put things in them, but also psychological. They gave you something to do with your hands. And in this picture, I think she looks kind of effortlessly cool with her hand in her pocket. And McCardell really understood that psychological experience of wearing clothes, being comfortable, and having the elements that you needed to move through the world. And she very early on began to sort of map on to clothing this idea of how they dictated how you could function in the world. And she was talking about the Gibson girl, if you remember that corseted look, that wasp waist is what they called it, so thin like a wasp. And she noticed, you couldn't breathe in it. Your job was to look pretty. You were an object. But McCardell always wanted a woman to be autonomous. She wanted to be autonomous. She wanted to be able to move through the world and not be dependent on men and not be laced to breathless beauty. So she grew up in this beautiful setting in Frederick. And my book, I wanted to explore how it is that, this woman born in 1905, outside of the centers of fashion, kind of rose to become one of our most important designers. And Frederick, Maryland had a strong influence on her. McCardell lived in a town that had historic mills. She saw how textiles were made. She had a grandfather who owned a candy factory, and her grandfather patented like candy molds. And so I think from a very early age, in addition to seeing Annie Kugel as some seamstress making clothes, she was also seeing industry at work. She was seeing her grandfather come up with an idea in his head, create a mold, patent the mold, and then make the object come to life. And so I think that for her, sort of seeing this idea of visioning, designing, and making from a young age helped her to realize that what you envisioned could be made. So she wanted to go to New York very early on as a teen to study fashion, but her father would not allow it at first. Her grandfather also co-founded in Frederick one of the first women's colleges to offer a bachelor's degree. It was walking distance from McCardell's home. So she went to Hood College to study home economics. And if you grew up when I did, my memory of home economics is baking cookies and learning to be a housewife. But what home economics meant at this time, it really was conceived as a back door for women into the sciences. The academic curriculum at Hood College at the time was rigorous, and it was chemistry, bacteriology. They were driving to nearby Baltimore to go study the burgeoning field of nutrition with the men. And so McCardell was enrolled in home economics, and unfortunately, she hated it. She was not an academic. She really was a designer at heart. She was an artist, and she struggled. She tried her best. It was not Hood's fault. But the one subject that she thrived in was geometry, because geometry was, the way 2D, 3D shapes come together. And what is sewing if not putting all of that together, right? So she really thrived at geometry and later would even make her letterhead graph paper. And even at Hood, which was quite progressive at the time, you could see these contradictions. This is something I found in my research. It's an ad that ran in the student newspaper. If every lady who reads this most interesting and progressive paper, the blue and gray, would only wear a corset, then you would have a much more peace of mind because your body would be shaped in the way it needed to be. And of course, McCardell just rejected all of this. She did not believe in corsets. She did not believe in forming the body to the clothes. She believed in the clothes fitting the woman's body and her life. And one of her childhood heroes was an Australian named Annette Kellerman. So Kellerman was a swimmer. She was competitive. And you can see the difference in these suits from those bathing costumes I showed you before. you notice that what Kellerman designed for herself was effectively a leotard. It was a tighter fitting, almost bathing suit. We're moving into the era of the bathing suit. And this was because it allowed her to swim. And Kellerman faced a lot of pushback. Municipal laws were in place that said, women had certain clothing restrictions in public. And this bathing suit violated just about every one of them. And if you notice, Kellerman in two of these pictures has on her legs what appear to be leggings. And something I didn't appreciate until I researched this book was that one of the municipal codes was that women had to wear wool swim stockings on public beaches because God forbid you see a woman's legs, and you could get arrested. And so in the 1920s, as women, I should say white women, have earned the right to vote in America, you're still seeing these very restrictive laws and dress codes that are written into municipal codes and into vice law. And you can see there's a photo of a woman being arrested in the 1920s. There's women being harassed on beaches to make sure that their swim costumes didn't violate the law. And, this was something, again, that McCardell really did not abide. And as a teenager on a sleepaway camp trip to YMCA camp in Big Pool, Maryland, she took her swim stockings off because they got in the way of her swimming. They weighed her down. And she knew she was going to get in trouble, and sure enough, she did. And that was really interesting to see for me, is that McCardell was already chipping away at these dress codes, even as a teenager. So she finally gets to New York. She is enrolled in what is now Parsons in the mid 1920s. And it's there that she meets Mildred Orrick, her roommate. There are no dorms at Parsons. They were living in special artist housing specifically for women, because again, New York City wasn't designed for single women who were not married. It was very difficult to find a place to live in New York as a single woman. In fact, many hotels wouldn't lease you a room because you were thought to be of ill repute. So the Three Arts Club, where Mildred and Claire lived, was this haven of women all studying and working in the arts. And Mildred was a flapper from Florida, and Claire, both of them saw themselves as modernists in much the same way O'Keeffe was. But, Parsons at the time was still very much rooted in a classical European arts education. Their first year was more of a fine arts class, really, than a design class, and they were being trained effectively to do what you see in that photo or that watercolor that Claire created for a class, which is to be fashion illustrators. This was a time when photography was in its nascent form, and really the way to communicate clothes, and those clothes, of course, were coming from Paris, was through fashion illustration. So after studying in Paris with Mildred at Parsons and learning about the haute couture tradition, where she bought a Madeleine Vianney couture dress on sale at a sample sale and took it apart just to see how it worked, McCardell literally took her own education into her hands. She learned that, fashion was really also about stealing. A part of what young designers like her were told to do was to take the steamship to Paris twice a year for the fashion shows and kind of steal as many designs as you could. And what we're seeing here is what American fashion meant in the 1930s. There was no fashion week. There wasn't even an organized system of shows. There was just a loose conglomeration of fall collections and spring collections and being released over sort of this hodgepodge of days in New York. This is Claire in the Garment District, 7th Avenue, and this is what passed for a buyer's preview. This is a small room set up within the larger warehouse, and these are the buyers. That's Claire standing there on the left. And buyers would sort of manhandle the clothes and check them out and place their orders. And this is McCardell later in her garment loft when she worked for Townley Frocks. And I just love seeing her in her milieu. She had this tiny little space where she's creating what will become some of our most iconic designs. And she's living in New York, and she's living in Murray Hill, which is, Midtown Manhattan. And even in the Depression, you're seeing Midtown rise, so the Depression didn't stop Rockefeller Center from going up all around you. And the other person who's living in Midtown Manhattan, not far from where McCardell would have her apartment, of course, is Georgia O'Keeffe. So she lived at the Shelton Hotel on Lexington. She was married to Alfred Stieglitz at this point. And you start to see, the role of landscape in O'Keeffe and her paintings at the time. And interestingly enough, the other person who lived at the Shelton in the 1920s was the man who would go on to become Claire's husband, Irving Drought Harris. My book uncovers this very complicated relationship that McCardell would have with Harris. He he was a bit of a cad. At the time he was living in the Shelton, he was courting a 19-year-old woman who was a sugar heiress, an heiress to the Spreckles sugar fortune. And he would end up divorcing her later in a very scandalous, gossip-laden divorce before moving on to date Claire. And their story is an interesting one. And I think in the book, I wanted to sort of explore why it is that she eventually married Harris. And I think, again, it had a lot to do with the time period and what was allowed and not allowed for a single woman in the world. So these are 3 dresses that are in the O'Keeffe collection. The one on the left and the one in the center are both McCardell's, and the one at the right is one that O'Keeffe copied from her gray dress in the center because she loved the design so much that she wanted to repeat it in other textiles. And one of the challenges of Claire's vision of clothing is that they didn't have hanger appeal. So if you think about those structured clothes that look so great on a hanger because they kind of held their shape because they were literally shaped by boning and whale boning, McCardell's dresses didn't have what her bosses thought of as a stylish way to sell themselves on a department store floor. And so she really struggled with this idea of hanger appeal because she couldn't convince her bosses that these dresses that looked so great on the body would register to a buyer at a department store. But Claire had very clever ways of getting around the sort of male dictated manufacturing world at the time. And her big breakthrough was the monastic dress. And this was a dress that, as one garment manufacturer said, my God, it has no front, it has no back, you just put it over your head. It was shocking at the time because it wasn't what was coming out of Paris. And I write in the book of the clever way that McCardell was able to sneak this into a collection. But once women saw it, they loved it. And it was brilliant because it allowed you to shape the dress to your own body. What is the biggest challenge of ready to wear, even to this day? It is the fact of fit. And that's McCardell in the center wearing an iteration of her monastic dress in the 1930s. And with the monastic, you could belt it at the waist, you could use a big sash, which is something McCardell loved, and the woman could really shape the dress to her own body. It didn't wrinkle. It was made out of fabrics that were able to stand up to life in the city, to life as a secretary. It had pockets. But nobody knew that she designed it outside of the fashion industry. On 7th Avenue, the name Claire McCardell suddenly became really well known. But to customers, her name wasn't in the label. In fact, it was called the Nada dress, and it was a proprietary dress of Best & Co., a department store in New York. And the reason is that at the time, there was no such thing as an American designer having their name on her label. The only named designers you really knew of at the time were mostly Parisian couture designers, Chanel and Paul Poiret and others, or in New York, a handful of couture designers like Hattie Carnegie or Valentina. And so at this point, Claire was not a known name because her name was not in her label. But you can see in some of these photos of O'Keeffe, the way in which a dress like this kind of works so beautifully. And in O'Keeffe's case, she's making it her own, which is what McCardell always hoped for. Make it your own with, those very gorgeous belts and the way that, O'Keeffe styled it and then her hair back, that minimalism. A woman could really take this dress and make it her own. So the other thing that McCardell is working on is she's working on what was known as play suits. Play suits are, in essence, I guess, what we would think of as athleisure wear. It's like, what would you wear while you're moving about in the world? And on the left there, you're seeing some of her early sketches that she was playing with at Parsons. And then in the middle and on the right, you start to see her playing with this idea of the gym bloomer, because gym bloomers were something most women had to wear when they were taking gym classes. But at the time when McCardell was a teen and in college, you really weren't wearing these out in public. It was still a time when women wearing bloomers, they would even have, basketball meets where men weren't allowed in, because heaven forbid, again, you see a woman's bare legs as she is playing sports. And what I love about what we're starting to see with McCardell is she's bringing these clothes into the public realm. And more than that, on the right, you're seeing another pioneering American modernist, photographer Louise Dahl Wolff, photographing these in the American landscape. So we're moving away from Paris. We're starting to come up with this American aesthetic. We're putting it outside of a stilted studio. And I love how Dahl Wolff put McCardell's play suit in the Arizona desert, and she put it in front of a Frank Lloyd Wright home. So here is McCardell in conversation with, one of the pioneering American architects. McCardell loved to swim. She loved the beach. That top photo on the left is her with Irving Drought Harris on the beach. There she is below. I believe that's on Fisher's Island, which is off the coast of New York, where she had a home. And you can start to see again, these suits are rather risque. It wasn't common again to have the fabric between the legs, and she created suits. She called her diaper suit jokingly because it looked like a woman was wearing a diaper on the beach. And some of these were seen as very risque at the time, because you could still see most women wearing these bathing suits with bathing skirts. And McCardell once said, if you want a dress, I have those too. But if you want a bathing suit, buy a bathing suit. And as you can see in this photo, again, another beautiful Louise Dahl Wolff on the right, they're not lined because the lining got in the way of swimming. And so you can see the hint of the breast. You can see the hint of the nipple. McCardell believed a woman's body was beautiful and should be celebrated, and she didn't want anything to get in the way of her experience swimming. And I look at her designs today, and they're timeless. I have seen that bikini recently, or a version of it from ready-to-wear brands today. I wish I had that exact bikini. That's beautiful. I love those buttons down the side. Another beautiful Louise Dahl Wolff with that gorgeous green, and another McCardellism, as they became known, were those spaghetti strap ties. Another way to sort of fit the suit to yourself, and to she used these in dresses as well. The other thing that really sets McCardell apart, in the same way that O'Keeffe set herself apart by using what she found in the desert to paint, is material. McCardell wasn't using expensive materials. She was trying to keep her clothes affordable and practical. She wanted a woman to be able to wash them, not have to dry clean them. And so, as a fellow designer of the time, Norman Morell, said, Claire could take $5 worth of common calico and turn it into a dress any woman would want to wear. And here we're seeing a photo shoot in Harper's Bazaar of a young Lauren Bacall wearing a pants outfit from McCardell. And McCardell always wanted her name on her label. she fought to keep that, to be able to get that right. And she ended up being able to do it. And you can see the label inside the O'Keeffe dress here. And in doing so, Claire McCardell became one of the first, if not the first, American ready-to-wear designers to get their name in a label. And it took her years. She fought hard for this, and she got it. And the other thing she's doing is she's designing a lot of clothes for herself. She was her own best model. She was her own best inventor. She wanted to move about the world in clothes that were comfortable and elegant. Now, this is a McCardell evening wear outfit that she wore herself. This belonged to her, and it looks like one gown, but it's actually separates. It's a skirt and a separate halter. And the reason is in the early 1930s, McCardell was doing all these required trips on steamships to Paris, and she was getting really weary of packing a steamer trunk. You had to pack all of these clothes. And part of the reason you did is because at the time, there were still expectations that a woman would move through the day wearing different outfits. You had what you wore at home. You had a day outfit that required a certain look. Then at tea time, you had a tea gown. In the evening, it was an evening gown. And McCardell wanted to wear something that she could take from day to night. She wanted materials that she could pack easily, that wouldn't wrinkle. She wanted what became known now as the capsule wardrobe, or mix and match separates. And at the time, this didn't exist in merchandising. Merchandisers did not know what to do with mix and match separates. She made hers in black wool jersey. You could move them into different ways. And it took years for this idea to take root. And when it finally did, here's a photo on the left of some of those separates as pictured in Vogue. It was presented as this idea of, you have 6 items that live 9 lives. And it was for the woman with more taste than money. She was really thinking about the working girl like herself. One of my favorite images and objects in O'Keeffe collection are her shoes. I just loved her shoes. And how much wouldn't you love some of these flats today? And including those beautiful ballet flats by Ferragamo. O'Keeffe, like McCardell, believed in a flat heel because you could move through the world a lot easier in them. McCardell rejected high heels. She did not care for them. And, Ferragamo started making flats like these in the 1950s and would go on to sort of famously design them for women like Audrey Hepburn. But where did the ballet flat kind of originate? It was with Claire. So here is Claire in 1941 with Ben Summers, the head of Capezio, the ballet slipper company. And war is happening in Europe. It's World War II is going on. America has been cut off from Paris. And America isn't in the war yet, but rationing is happening because it's clear that we're probably not going to be able to stay out of it. And McCardell had this idea to make ballet slippers to match her collection. And she went to Capezio and asked if they could make some fabric ballet shoes to match her clothes. And then you can see some photo shoots that happened with Claire McCardell designs. And this really was the beginning of the ballet flat. And women loved them, of course, one of the most enduring designs today. This is the socialite and model Slim Keith, a future Truman Capote swan. She's wearing a McCardell outfit in this 1945 Harper's Bazaar photo shoot. And I mean, how modern does this look? And how much does this presage Audrey Hepburn, right? Those leggings and the beautiful ballet flats and that modern chunky gold jewelry. It's just so modern. And what is influencing McCardell as she's thinking about and inventing these designs? It's not just her travel life. It's not just her work in the garment district. much like O'Keeffe, she was also very influenced by her landscape. She was influenced by the landscape in Frederick, where she grew up. And then this is Frenchtown, New Jersey. She ended up renting and later buying a farmhouse out in New Jersey on the Delaware River. And on the other side, you have Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is where the Algonquin crew, Dorothy Parker and others, are setting up their rural retreat. But the fashion world was really going to Frenchtown at the time. And McCardell loved it because she loved nature, she loved the outdoors, she loved that there was no electricity there for a time. And she would go to Frenchtown to really escape. And you could take a train straight from Grand Central at the time and get there in no time. This was a place of partying. It was almost a little artist retreat. Louise Dahl Wolfe had a house nearby and others. On the left, you can see McCardell with her husband Irving on the left and another friend enjoying martinis. That's her in her kitchen. You know, McCardell in New York was a career woman who worked hard. In Frenchtown, she loved to spend time cooking over an open fire. She loved to throw parties for all of her friends. And it really became a place where she could do some of her best design thinking. She was equally informed by her hobbies. She liked to ski, she liked to fish, and she took her cues from the industrial items on those clothes. So you can start to see how like the hooks on her ski boots informed the hooks, you know, on a raincoat. She started to put these beautiful, very industrial looking brass eyes and hooks on her dresses because it really was this modern form meets function that informed her designs. And the thing to know about all of these closures is they weren't fake. You weren't having a fake bow or a fake button or a fake hook. They all functioned as a closure. And of course, pockets. McCardell could often be seen with her hands in her pockets. She fought long and hard to get pockets in the clothes that she designed. It was not something that male manufacturers believed were necessary. I write more about this in the book, about her long battle for getting pockets into all of her clothes. And to this day, when you compliment a woman on a dress, how often does she's like, and it has pockets? Because to this day, it's still very difficult to get something as functional as a pocket into women's wear. You know, McCardell pioneered and invented other things as well. On the left, you are seeing what was then called a Superman hood, but today we might think of it as a hoodie. You know, the hoodie already existed in menswear. It was used on sweatshirts and in other men's costuming, but McCardell helped to bring the hoodie into women's wear. And it was on items like this, which was a winter bicycling outfit, because during the Depression and during the war, when rubber was rationed, women were bicycling all year round. And McCardell hated being uncomfortable. She hated being cold. She hated being too hot. She hated being wet because her swimsuit wasn't drying. So she was thinking of every aspect of a woman's experience, including how to have pedal pushers and a hoodie for when you went biking. That middle photo are a pair of fishing trousers. And on the right, one of my favorite bathing suits that includes those brass eye and hook closures. So these are some of my favorite O'Keeffe wrap dresses. O'Keeffe loved a wrap dress, and who doesn't? It, again, solves that problem of fit. You can fit it to the body, wrap it to size. And she had a big collection of wrap dresses. And again, it was McCardell who helped to popularize the wrap dress in the early 40s. This is a design known as the popover. The popover began when the famous fashion editor of Harper's Bazaar, Deanna Vreeland, came to Claire McCardell and said, women are struggling. It's the war. There were other designers who were working on figuring out what women would wear to the factories that they were increasingly working in. This is when you start to see the overall Rosie the Riveter look. Vreeland wanted McCardell to think about the experience of a woman at home. And, your spouse is abroad, you have children, you might be working outside of the home yourself. Domestic help is no longer available because most domestic workers begin working with the war effort. And so McCardell was tasked with designing a dress for the homemaker, the housewear. Interestingly enough, during this time, during the rations that were going on in America, aprons were not allowed. They were seen as a waste of fabric. You had to use what you already had. McCardell kind of cleverly made a dress as an apron. This was made out of a material that was also very rare in women's wear at the time. It was made out of denim. You could pop it over your existing clothes and wear it to clean the house or to cook dinner, or you could wear it on its own. And you can see the model on the right is a famous wife of a polo player. She was used to model this design. And then because Claire was kind of cheeky, she added a pot holder that you could attach at the waist. You got one big patch pocket because patch pockets were also rationed. And she made hers big enough that you could put a flashlight in it for a blackout drill or a novel. It was so pioneering that she patented it, and she got a patent. It was very rare. It's still rare to get a patent for a clothing design, as most designs are very iterative. But you have to remember what's going on at this time. It's the birth of American fashion. It's the birth of what is known as the American look. And McCardell is trying to protect, sort of taking a cue from the Parisians and saying, how do we start to protect this American look? And she made the popover for the rest of her career. She evolved it into a wrap dress. On the left, you can see a wrap dress that's currently on display at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, which has a great Claire McCardell exhibition. McCardell knew that back zippers were absurd, as one person wrote, Alexandra Dutch, because she knew that if you lived alone and you tried to zip yourself up in the back, it was going to be awful if you wrenched out your arm. And so again, as the dress on the right shows you, she put the closures on the side because McCardell lived alone until she was nearly 40. She was in her late 30s before she got married. She didn't have a maid dressing her. She was getting dressed on her own and was always thinking about the woman's experience. And so now we can see why this dress was so revolutionary and why O'Keeffe loved it. And as we look more at the dress that O'Keeffe owned, look at those large armholes. That was the other thing that McCardell did. She liked a dolman sleeve, sometimes known as a batwing sleeve. She liked these wide openings because it allowed you to move. You could grab a strap on the subway, you could hail a cab. If you're O'Keeffe, you could go rafting in it. You could go collect rocks and put it in the pockets. And again, you could make it your own with your own styling and your own belts. The other thing about this dress that's interesting is that the design detail that is most noticeable, if you look closely, is this red top stitching. So McCardell's also borrowing from menswear there, using the top stitching for denim in a lovely red so that it's durable, but also a nice design element. And McCardell really thought about sports clothes. Everything she was designing under this big umbrella of sports clothes, she saw these as a way to revolutionize a woman's life. It was, a way that you could live well in the world and be an independent woman, be comfortable and get on with your life. And of course, women loved her for it. And she became one of the most famous designers in America. She was a household name, cover of Life, cover of Time magazine. She was writing essays for the new Sports Illustrated magazine, in this case, one called Women Are What They Wear, about the ways in which sportswear allowed women to solve their own problems, to once the clothes problem is solved, then you could get on with your life. And like O'Keeffe, McCardell was very smart and about her public image, about her brand. So she's starting to brand herself. She's creating her own font. These are some ads. She is licensing her image in the right moments, and she is creating sunglasses, she's creating jewelry, she's creating raincoats and patterns. She's becoming the multifaceted designer that we understand today. And let's remember, this did not exist when she began her career. She became so popular that effectively she became what we believe is the first fashion designer in America to have her own retrospective at a modern art gallery in Beverly Hills. This was at the Frank Pearl's Gallery. So she's being shown in a place that's showing, the modernist artists in a retrospective in 1953. And Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus said she is one of the few creative designers this country has ever produced. You can see women wearing her designs at the Frank Pearl's Gallery. She's being juxtaposed against modern art. And Look magazine did this incredible spread. I wish I had a better image of this, of 20 years of her designs. And you can see how pioneering she was. Like, so much of what she created, you can see a lot of what we wear today in these designs, including, if you look in the back to the right there, a wedding gown with a hood. And soon, McCardell is taking this American look to Europe. So in 1955, there is something called the Modern Masters print. A textile company called Fuller Fabrics commissioned 5 of the world's top modernist designers, including Chagall and Picasso, who's pictured at the bottom there, to put their art onto fabric. And the idea was, for less than $1, you could wear a Picasso. And McCardell was the one who was commissioned to make ready-to-wear designs out of this fabric. I can't help but think what would happen if some of these were women. We had Grace Hardigan, we had Georgia O'Keeffe, we had Helen Frankenthaler. Imagine that as a beautiful textile line. I would much prefer that. But we still have these beautiful fabrics. And here now McCardell travels over to Europe to go get photos of these in Picasso's, south of France home. The model in that red pant outfit is Bettina. She's the top designer of haute couture. And now here you see America and Claire McCardell firmly in Europe, and they are embracing her ready-to-wear. But it didn't come without backlash. This is a story that I found that really helped spark my book. I found this story that was written by Betty Friedan years before she wrote The Feminine Mystique. And it's called The Gal Who Defied Dior. This is a profile that Friedan wrote about Claire McCardell in the 1950s. And I wanted to understand what that defiance was. And I wanted to understand why Friedan, a feminist, who would go on to help spur second wave feminism, why did she want to have a conversation with Claire McCardell? And really what McCardell was in defiance to was what came post-war. 1947, Paris is back. Christian Dior, who, believe it or not, was the same age as McCardell, he launches what would become the new look. And the new look was predicated on a highly structured female silhouette. That wide shoulder, that thin wasp waist, that wide hip. On the left, you see the corset that is used, that is a Dior corset. That is an instructional video from a newsreel about how to get ready to put on outfits like the one you see at right, the bar suit. And the press dubbed it the new look, but of course we've seen this, right? This is what McCardell saw in the Gibson Girl silhouette. It was a return to a regressive structuring of women's bodies. It prompted Chanel to say, Dior doesn't dress women, he upholsters them. And Dior said, I want to structure a woman. I want to save her from nature. And he was making a woman an object again. And McCardell was having none of it. And guess what? It's back. Yay! Corsets are back, everybody. And this was just from a few days ago. This is the singer Sabrina Carpenter wearing an updated Dior New Look silhouette. And it's being heralded as, the future of Dior. This was the future towards the end of McCardell's life. She was beginning to use materials, as you see in that upper model, of leather, another material that was not very common in women's wear. She always was centering the woman's experience. And unfortunately, McCardell died young. She died at 52. She had colon cancer. And I love this dress, this Pucci dress that would belong to O'Keeffe. I mean, it looks a bit like a monastic, right? This big dress taken in at the waist. And when McCardell died, the world truly mourned, including Emilio Pucci, who wrote this beautiful letter to Townley about how he is saying, I cannot believe that McCardell is dead. She was so influential to me. And she remains deeply influential to this day in design. We may have forgotten her name, but fashion designers have not. And I love to do the then and now. Then a McCardell bubble dress. Now the actress Zendaya wearing a modern day, version of that just last year. And I'll end on one of my favorite finds in the archive, which is this letter that a customer wrote to McCardell, a 10-page letter basically outlining how one McCardell dress had seen her through maternity, parenthood, travel. She wore the dress for 10 years. She wore it down the Nile. She wore it as evening wear. And she said at the end, thank you for the very good dress. And McCardell saved letters like these because even though Joan Crawford and Greta Garbo wore her clothes, to McCardell, it was the every woman that mattered the most. And she never forgot them when she was designing. And so I want to thank you so much. That ends the formal part of the presentation. And I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Wow, Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And one of the best parts from my experience about working with the O'Keeffe Museum is that I'm actually able to learn so much more about other women, her contemporaries, and the ways in which their incredible work, dovetails with what we see in these iconic photos of O'Keeffe and things like that. So thank you so much and for your tremendous research. It was really enjoyable to learn about
Oh,
Cardle.
thank you.
And I want to remind people to ask some questions. We are seeing lots of just lovely remarks that your talk was so interesting and to thank you for your time.
And I should add, if you want to buy the book, I would not be doing my job. You can buy it anywhere books are sold. You can buy it you can go on my website, eedickinson.com. And yeah, it's available and ready everywhere.
Fantastic. And we do send a follow-up email and we'll include that information there as well. We have Kathleen here in the chat who says she loves your book. She just finished it. And she also points out, the return to the structured fashion, the highly profiled wedding of Lauren Sanchez Bezos and Jeff Bezos and the Gibson Girl silhouette of her dress. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are it's a canary in the coal mine for what's happening to women and women's rights, frankly. Like, fashion is a purveyor of cultural truth. And I think that what we're seeing is a move back to what's being called the trad wife tradition, this idea that women should go back to the kitchen and have babies and be corseted and become objects again, not purveyors of their own independent and autonomous lives. So I see the corset as being a really a concerning return to an idea of a woman being highly controlled. And as I write in the book and what we saw at that wedding, it's not just the corset itself, it's also the idea of the internalized corset. This idea that women are being told they need to do enough hot yoga classes that they can have this armature of strong abdomen or surgery. So, McCardell was always about women's freedom, and I land with McCardell.
No, that is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing more about that. And we're seeing more comments, just on the same kind of topic there, the way that fashion has a tendency to change over time and go back. We do have folks who are wondering how they can see McCardell designs in person, or if there are other labels that have taken over her proprietary designs, for people who want to go back to her style, to her fashion.
If you're in or near Baltimore, there's an excellent exhibition here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, which has the largest archive of McCardell clothes and ephemera. That's where I did a lot of my research. That's called Claire /McCardell, and that is up. the Met and other museums have collected McCardell, and there have been some shows over the years. And I think right now also there's an excellent exhibition at the Philadelphia Art Museum called Boom, which I don't remember the full title, but it's about design in the 1940s, and there's some excellent McCardell dresses there. In terms of who's continuing, Tory Burch has done a lot to keep McCardell's name alive. She created a Tory Burch Fellowship at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. She re-released some McCardell inspired designs in 2022. And she also re-released McCardell's book, What Shall I Wear? And so right now there isn't a McCardell brand per se, but there are those within the fashion world who are certainly trying to keep her aesthetic alive.
That's fantastic. And we have India in the comments also saying that the New York Historical Society currently also has a show on
Yes, I can't believe I forgot the New York Historical. You can see an original popover that was given to the museum for display by a scholar of McCardell named Julie Iber. So yes, there's an excellent opportunity to see some McCardell at the New York Historical.
Fantastic. And we're getting requests for some in the follow-up email for a list of these places, because we clearly have some excited participants who want to see this incredible work in person. Gosh, they're really coming in. I'm so sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, but we do have time for just a couple more. How about as far as Georgia O'Keeffe and how she obtained dresses, or how maybe other people would have obtained dresses by Claire McCardell, is this something that she would have necessarily maybe bought in a store, or what were ways that they were actually obtained at that time?
Absolutely. So McCardell was ready to wear. So she was being sold through department stores. She was being sold through small specialty shops and boutiques. Somebody said to me, "Oh, I can't believe O'Keeffe copied a dress. Isn't that against what they all wanted to do?" And it's like, the answer is no, no. You have to remember McCardell died in 1958. And it wasn't unusual for a woman to have a dress that she loved that she couldn't get anymore and then have a seamstress make it or sew it herself. And so McCardell did start to put out some patterns. I know some people who have found some great McCardell patterns on Etsy. And the idea was that you could get McCardell at department stores. Women like Dorothy Shaver, who was one of the first women to run and be president of a major department store, Lord and Taylor, championed the work of women like Claire. And what I hope my book shows is that it wasn't just a singular woman, it was this confluation, this constellation of really talented women who birthed American fashion. And I was interested in understanding not only them, but we're now realizing like MoMA was mostly women. Like the birth of so much that we take for granted today was because of extraordinary and talented women in mid-century.
So true. And since we are right at 10 o'clock, I do like to close out these conversations with a comment from the chat. And I'll share this from Kathleen, who says, "I don't think young women today understand how far we've come in such a short time. We're not long from measuring skirt lengths on the beach," from your early pictures in your presentation. She says, "Bravo, and thank you for sharing a designer I was not aware of, and I look forward to reading your book." And I want to echo that. Thank you so much. I had not heard of Claire McCardell, but I clearly, I owe her a lot for the comforts and the fashion that I enjoy in my life as a woman in 2025. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share before we say thank you, or any
I
final thoughts?
I think one of the best comments I got recently from a reader was, "I didn't know Claire McCardell, but I realized I've always loved her," meaning that she is in our DNA, like she's in our fashion DNA. And I think the other thing is, I think I hope this helps everyone think about like fashion isn't just this frivolous thing, right? I really wanted to locate in McCardell in the lineage of women's history, of suffragism, of freedoms and rights. And so really it's this idea that, fashion really is important to how we move through our lives. And McCardell always believed good fashion has a right to survive. Well, hers has survived. She was a true inventor, and it continues. And I'm so glad I got to talk about her in context with Georgia O'Keeffe. So thank you so much. And thank you all for coming today.
Thank you so much and for this tremendous research. And now I know when I wear my favorite dress, which happens to have big pockets, who to thank for that. So again, thank you so much for your time. Very much looking forward to reading the book. And to those of you who are with us, we will send that information in the follow-up email so that you can also learn more about this great research. And in the meantime, thank you again for being here. Elizabeth, thank you so much for everything. We look forward to learning even more.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again for being here.